Where will the employment opportunities be in 5 years from now? Analyst Ross Elliott at the not-for-profit group called the Suburban Alliance has been crunching federal government data. And the data shows job growth in Australia is particularly focused in two major cities, but not in the city centre of those cities. Ross Elliott, thanks for coming in.
Pleasure to be here.
Where are the jobs currently on the east coast of Australia?
We're very heavily exposed to Sydney and Melbourne metropolitan markets, which are apparently gobbling up a greater share of jobs right around the country. These federal government figures show the situation now, what they think the situation now is in 2018 and where they think it'll be in 2023. And according to these guys at least, and they know as well as anyone else, I guess, those share of jobs is going to increase in Sydney and Melbourne. Brisbane does okay, and the other capitals sort of limp along. But it seems to be that we are becoming even more reliant on Sydney and Melbourne. But what's also really interesting is that in none of these capital cities is the share of inner city jobs what we might think it is, and that most of the jobs in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth are spread across the metropolitan area. They're not in what you might call the inner 5K ring, which accounts for, depending on where you put the boundaries, 10 to 20% of the whole region's jobs.
Which is what we assume, that there's sort of like a hothouse sort of effect, an intensity in the inner city areas of the major cities, but that's not supported by the evidence as far as you're concerned.
Well, no, it hasn't been supported by the census. It hasn't been supported by evidence for a long time, in fact. So I suppose where the Suburban Alliance has been coming from is to say, well, look, we've done such a spectacular job with urban renewal around Australia, and Brisbane probably leads that in many respects, but most of that effort has been focused on the inner city markets. And we've got a lot of positive things to show for it. I mean, you're in part of it right here at the ABC studios. But what have we done to support the development of jobs or the enhancement of places in some of these metropolitan areas where 80% of people are in fact going to work?
Well, I'll drill down to Brisbane and other places here very shortly, but you observe what you describe as an imbalance in Australia's settlement policy. Why and where?
Well, probably because we are becoming more and more reliant on Sydney and to a less extent Melbourne. And they have, in effect, they've been hoovering up jobs from around the country, driven a lot by technology, higher-end banking, finance, legal and other professional roles have been increasingly headquartered in Sydney and, as I said, to a lesser extent, Melbourne. So it's no surprise that that's where 80% of the population growth is going. A lot of new migrants want to go to where they perceive all the jobs are. What we haven't done in that time has been sensible about making some of these places we'd like migrants to go to attractive as places to live in or work in. Have they got the right infrastructure, schools, hospitals, roads, transport, telecommunications infrastructure? Have we improved placemaking qualities in some of these centres, which, you know, many of them look like they've been overlooked for the best part of 30 or 40 years? You're not going to want to move to somewhere that looks like Australia's version of the third world, and you're not going to want to set up a business there, even if the government tells you you should.
My guest is analyst Ross Elliott. He's written a piece for the Suburban Alliance looking at where the jobs are in about 5 years from now. This is ABC Radio Brisbane. Steve Austin's my name. The federal government is currently exploring options about population pressure and infrastructure in Sydney and Melbourne primarily. What could they be looking at here in Brisbane?
Well, on their own forecast, they're talking about regions like Ipswich, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, Moreton Bay, all picking up a very large share of jobs growth in Queensland.
Your article or your analysis shows that Ipswich in 5 years' time is going to be a real, a significant area of job growth.
It's going to grow, according to these numbers, it'll grow the fastest of any particular region.
Faster than Brisbane?
On percentage terms, faster than Brisbane, yeah. And that'll probably be driven by health and education jobs, as it is in most places, but also defence. They've got the booming Ripley Valley. There's a lot of construction jobs out there as well, building homes for people. So that doesn't seem unreasonable. Ipswich wants to be able to keep those jobs. So you'd say to the federal government, if it came to something like Ipswich, you'd say, well, what role can the federal government play in supporting the infrastructure needs of Ipswich to improve its livability qualities, its transport infrastructure, health and other infrastructure that makes it a desirable place to stay?
So in 5 years from now, the percentage-wise, the job growth hotspots are Ipswich, sort of Gold Coast, and then the south side of Brisbane. In other words, the future of job growth is actually south of Brisbane, between here, Ipswich, and the Gold Coast. That's where there's a significant percentage growth in jobs and employment.
And to the north, Moreton Bay and the Sunshine Coast are doing very well at the moment. Those markets are on fire. Brisbane's doing well. Let's not, let's not understate how well Brisbane is going. And you've done the shows, Steve. I mean, you know the story about Queen's Wharf, about Brisbane Live, Howard Smith Wharves. The infrastructure improvements that are going to take place here are going to make this a very, very exciting city. But reflecto on the nature of the big projects. They are largely around culture, recreation, entertainment, leisure. They're not necessarily all large, shiny office buildings at the moment. So we're almost seeing a change in the way the city centre is being used. It's largely, increasingly a place for leisure, recreation and entertainment, and less all about housing some lawyers or accountants in their shiny new offices.
Let me just go back a little bit. I know you've touched on this, but you don't fully accept the so-called knowledge worker, city core argument, do you? But one that grows organically in suburban districts in metro regions. Is that right?
Well,
we
yes.
assume that everything's going to happen in the Valley and Newstead,
Not everything. No, well, there's no evidence to say everything's going to happen there. The jobs that are going to grow the most, according to most of the forecasts that are around, are in health and social assistance and also in education. Now, by their very nature, those jobs aren't centralised jobs. The last time we had a look at it, the only occupation in the census where more than half are headquartered in the CBD was lawyers. And I think it was about 60% of all lawyers in South East Queensland can be found within spitting distance of the GPO, and that wasn't. It was followed closely behind by engineers. A lot of the other occupations are growing in suburban areas, and that's because the nature of the economy is changing. So there will be plenty of jobs growth in the CBD. There's 120-something thousand jobs there now. If you add in shoppers, residents, students, the daily population of the CBD is about 170-odd thousand people. It's huge. It's a very large concentration of people. But equally, we've got a lot of regional centres that could do with some infrastructure attention to support their future growth. And you look at Ipswich, you can look at Springwood, you can look at the success of Springfield. There's opportunities around Chermside, around Salisbury, Caboolture, Cleveland Town Centre. And many of these places are ripe for renewal. It just seems timely that we devote a little bit of attention and some infrastructure support to helping them grow.
Well, let's look at Springwood and Chermside on the south and the north. What do you want government planners to do about this when you say urban renewal?
Well, it's a difficult challenge, but I would say with respect
Springwood's a mess as far as I can see.
Springwood is a mess, but it has a huge potential. A lot of the land is locked up in the hands of a few owners. I know Luke Smith, when he was mayor there, was very keen on seeing Springfield develop and hopefully... Springwood, I'm sorry. And I hope that, when Logan gets its sort of civic leadership sorted out again, that focus will come back to how do we make more of Springwood as a regional business centre, and likewise with Chermside.
It's got this annoying M1 motorway running right through the middle of it, cutting everything in half.
It does cut it in half, but the centre to the east of the M1 could develop more as a regional business centre. Getting in, off and back onto that motorway is a real challenge, knowing which exit to take, and it's almost invisible too as you drive past it at the moment. So it has little presence, but that M1 is a great asset.
If governments were to redesign or put infrastructure into Springwood, or let's go Chermside in the north, what would change? What would improve? Where would they get their bang for the taxpayer dollar? Because, like the state government, we're in so massive debt at a state, 83, nearly, not quite, but somewhere between 80 and 83 billion dollars worth of public debt. They're going to want to get significant bang for their buck to put any sort of change investment in there. Yeah,
well, have a think about Nunda, which, 15 to 20 years ago, was a pretty run-down suburban centre. Sandgate Road ran through it. It was hard to park. There were 4 lease signs that had been up so long they'd been heritage listed. I mean, it was a shocking place. No one wanted to admit living near Nunda. For the total cost between state and council of $60 million to divert that road and make some planning improvements, they got $800 million in new development and urban enhancement in Nunda. Now people are proud to live there. In fact, I'm told that people are now moving into Northgate so that they can be close to Nunda. So there's a good bang for your buck. They fixed transport, they made some planning changes, and they supported the area through suburban renewal by the council's initiative. So it can be done, and it can be done on a bigger scale.
My guest is Ross Elliott from the Suburban Alliance. He's an analyst with APP, which is a property and infrastructure specialist organisation. This is ABC Radio Brisbane. Steve Austin's my name. If they do that, if they do these sort of things, I think you're actually right that there's increasing evidence of employment dispersal and location of jobs, and it's going to transform the urban economies of the future if they do this. Explain, please.
Well, technology is a big driver of that, but also the changing nature of growth industry. So you take health and social assistance. A lot of jobs are going to be created. They're ahead by a country mile of almost any other industry. The nature of those jobs is that they look after people within their sort of local catchment. They kind of have a retail flavour in that case. So you don't necessarily want them all headquartered in one part of the region. So we are looking at growth throughout South East Queensland. Ipswich Hospital, Logan Hospital, Redlands is growing its hospital base. Where else? Let's see, I've forgotten a few. Redcliffe, you go right around the region. There are some major developments in health and social assistance. Private health as well, a lot of day surgeries popping up. In fact, one of our strategic focuses for our business is to look at that social infrastructure space and where it's going to grow in the future and what types of facilities are going to be needed. That's changing the nature of where people will be working. That's also going to change the nature of how people move from point A to point B. It's going to change the nature of commuting, public transport, private transport, a whole bunch of things. So it doesn't take much to realise that in 20 years' time, the industries of the future are going to be a lot different to the ones that they were 20 years ago. It just seems sensible to apply some thinking to what those needs will be in 20 years' time, rather than this is what we've done for the last 20 years, we'll just keep doing that again.
You actually write a national program of meaningful and strategic regional and suburban renewal will be a step in the right direction.
Yes.
And this requires what? Federal government to talk with the state government and give them money?
Well, look, the federal government did have they've had a succession of cities ministers lately. The focus of the federal government has in the past been on inner urban renewal.
And you're asking them to change direction?
Well, I think if they want to see employment opportunities disperse, if they want to see population pressure disperse, they need to think about how to make some of these alternative centres look attractive in the eyes of businesses and in the eyes of residents. And what does it take to achieve that?
Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for the time.
Ross Elliott. Ross wrote a piece for the Suburban Alliance.